Hey everyone, welcome back for another very exciting tutorial here at the PhotoshopTrainingChannel.com. My name is Jesus Ramirez and you can find me on Twitter at JRFromPTC. In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at blending modes and how they work. If you want to follow along, feel free to download the tutorial files from my website, PhotoshopTrainingChannel.com. Okay, so let's get started with this tutorial. Blend modes are a great way to expand the power of layers in Photoshop. A blend mode takes the pixels or colors of one layer and blends them with the pixels of another layer to create a completely new effect. This is very different than stacking layers on top of one another and simply reducing the fill or opacity. The blend between the layers is dictated by the algorithm of the selected blend mode. Blend modes can be applied to any item in the layers panel, including text layers, adjustment layers, and even groups, which makes blend modes a great way to create non-destructive effects since you can always come back and adjust the opacity or fill or even switch to a different blend mode. As of Photoshop CC and since Photoshop CS5, there are 27 blend modes which can be found near the upper left corner of the layers panel in an unlabeled drop-down menu. By default, all layers are set to normal, but you can click on the drop-down menu and choose any other. Although many tools in Photoshop also have blend modes, in this tutorial we'll primarily focus on how they work with layers. But the principles are universal and they will work in a very similar fashion. One thing to keep in mind when working with blend modes is that each pixel in a layer is looked at when the blend mode is applied, meaning that the algorithm is applied one pixel at a time to get the resulting blend. To make things a little bit easier to understand, I'll sometimes refer to pixels as colors, since the word color might help your mind create a more accurate image of what's going on, but in reality we're always talking about pixels. You should also remember these three terms in order to better understand how the blend modes work. The base is the original color of the layer. This is the color found directly below the blend color. The blend is the color that is being applied to the base color. This is usually the layer directly above the base layer. And the result is the resulting color, which is the result after mixing the base and blend colors. Each of the 27 blend modes have a different algorithm, a mathematical equation that utilizes brightness and darkness values, the luminance levels, to determine how the colors will blend. And don't worry about it, there's not going to be any math in this tutorial. The math is not required for you to understand or master blend modes. To make things easier for us, Photoshop has arranged the blend modes into different categories. So each of these dividers that you see here represent a different section of blend modes, and we're going to talk about each section and some of these blend modes individually a little bit further into this tutorial. Also in this tutorial I created these files here, and we're going to go through them as we work with the tutorial, so don't worry about them for now. We have the original file, which is this image here of a statue. So with blend modes, by default all layers are set to normal. That means that there's no math and no algorithms applied. So any opaque pixels will completely cover the pixels in the layer below it. I'm going to turn this layer on, titled Luminance, and is this image I created here showing a black bar, a white bar, white, 50% gray, and black, and a gradient that goes from black to white. We also have these bars here representing luminance values. So this is 100%, which is white, 90, 80, 70, 50% gray, which is the same as this here, and all the way up to 0, which is black. And if you don't know what that is, let me just double click on the foreground color here to bring up the color picker. And when I hover over the image here, I click on the white, you'll see right here in this section the hue, saturation, and brightness. The brightness is 100%. And I click on the next one, it's 90, 80, 70, 60, and 50. So this is 50% gray, and you probably heard about this before. This is used a lot in retouching. So 50% gray is right in the middle in between black and white. And this graphic is going to help us understand how the blend modes work. And of course there's color involved in images, but it's easier to understand when we're working with black and white images. So at some point I'll turn this on and we'll see how the blend modes work with it. But again, for you to better understand how the blend modes work, it's easier to think just in black and white, since a lot of blend modes work with the luminance values of the image. So I'm just going to click on this layer, luminance, and we're going to talk about the first blend mode. Actually, we already did normal. This just means that no algorithm is applied to the image, so any opaque pixels will stay and will completely cover everything below it. The next blend mode is dissolve, and nothing happens when you first change it to that blend mode. You actually start seeing what it does when you reduce the opacity And what this blend mode does is it applies a diffusion dither pattern. These are just random specks that become scattered as the opacity is reduced. So you can see how that works. Sort of like adding noise to a layer almost. I'm going to bring that back to 100%. So that is the first section, the normal and dissolve blend modes. The next section, and you can see the divider here, from darken to darken color, these 5 blend modes here all deal with the dark colors of your image. So these blend modes in this group will turn the resulting colors darker. This is because the dark pixels of the selected layer remain opaque while the lighter pixels become transparent, giving the overall image a darkening effect. The first blend mode is a darken blend mode, and this blend mode looks at the luminance value in each RGB channel and selects either the base or blend color depending on which is darker as a result color. So simply put, the darkest color is kept and the lightest color is discarded. So you can see here how black is darker than everything else back here. So black stays. 50% gray and white is not, so they disappear. You can see that happening here in the gradient. I'm going to set it back to normal. Notice how it's going from white to black. I'm going to go back to darken. So all these colors are lighter than the colors below them, so they completely disappear, while the darkest colors stay. So this blend mode doesn't actually blend the pixels. It either keeps one or the other. It keeps the darkest. So darkest stays, darkest stays, darkest stays. So you can clearly see what's going on here. The gray is staying, but the white below it, or the light greens are disappearing. The multiply blend mode multiplies the luminance values of the base color and the blend color. So what this means is that it just takes the darkest color and multiplies it by the color below it, so giving it a darkening effect. So you can see how that works here. White has no change, and then as you increase the luminance values, the image below it gets darker. So this is a great blending mode if you're creating shadows or you're darkening up an image. An example of that would be, I have this image here. You might have an image that's maybe a little bit overblown, a little washed out, and you want to darken it up. One thing you can do is create a new adjustment layer. You can pretty much use any of these adjustment layers, but the one that I like to use is curves, and then set the blending mode to multiply, and you'll see how that right away makes that image darker, and it gives a lot more contrast to the image. And one thing I like to do is maybe create a nice S curve here to give it even more contrast, and you can always use the opacity sliders to adjust that image. So that's one thing you can do with the multiplied blend mode. And I'm just gonna delete that since we won't be needing it anymore. Oops, I accidentally deleted the mask, not the layer. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the next blend mode, which is color burn. And color burn gives you a darker result than multiply, so it increases the contrast between the base and blend colors, resulting in a more highly saturated midtone and reducing the highlights. This is actually a very similar result as you would get when you use the burn tool to darken an image. You can kind of see that here, how it's burning this a little bit. The linear burn blend mode decreases the brightness of the base color based on the value of the blend color. The result is darker than multiply, but a little less saturated than color burn, and you can see that here, how it's not as saturated as color burn or even here in the blue. And finally, we have the darker color. This is another one of those blend modes that does not blend the pixels. It simply compares the base and blend colors and keeps the darkest one of the two. It's actually very similar to what the darken blend mode does, but it uses the composite channel instead of separate the RGB channels. So what I mean by that is that the darker color blend mode looks just at the RGB composite and makes its blend based on that. The darker blend mode looks at each individual channel, the red, green, and blue, and then makes the blend. So the result is very similar. In most cases, they'll be very, very similar. You won't be able to tell the difference, but at least you know what the difference is now. Okay, so those were the darkening blend modes. The lighten blend modes are very similar, but they work in the opposite way. the lighter areas of the selected layer remain opaque and the dark areas become translucent. So one way to think about this is that these blend modes are the opposite of these guys. So the opposite of darken will be lighten, opposite of multiply is screen, opposite of color burn is color dodge, the opposite of linear burn is linear dodge, and the opposite of darken color is lighter color. So these blend modes are the opposite of these guys. So if I click on lighten, you'll notice that the opposite happens as with darken. The blend mode looks at either the base or blend color, and it keeps the lighter one as a result color. So white is obviously lighter than anything below it, so it keeps white, and the same thing with this gray color here. So just like darken, this is not a blend mode that blends the pixels of the two layers. It simply picks one or the other, and of course it keeps the lightest one. Screen is a lot like multiply, but it works the opposite way. It blends the light luminance values with the pixels of the image below it, so it makes things a little bit brighter. One thing you can do with screen is something that you can do with multiply, but just the other way around. We're going to add a curves adjustment layer, and we're going to set it to screen, and it's going to brighten up this image that was too dark, and it brings out some detail. And you can of course make the image lighter and maybe bring in the light values back down so we don't overblow the image. And we can also use the layer mask if you want to by using the brush tool, selecting black, and one thing we can do with that is just paint back some of the darker colors if we want to, but we're not going to worry about that for this tutorial. So this is another way you can use adjustment layers to make dark images bright again so you can bring back some detail. So I'm going to get rid of that. And by the way, what some people do is they take the layer they're working on, they duplicate it, and they set it to screen, and that's okay, but there's a downside to that. When you duplicate a layer, you're going to increase the file size of your document, and that's not always a good idea. And also, you don't have the advantages of using curves to further enhance your image. So I prefer to use adjustment layers for those two reasons. Okay, so now we're going to talk about color dodge, and this blend mode gives you a brighter result than screen by decreasing the contrast between the base and blend colors, resulting in a saturated midtone, and it blows out the highlights. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to switch this blend mode to color dodge, and you'll see here that this area that's very light, it just becomes white because that's what this blend mode does. It makes the lighter colors become white, and it saturates the image. The next blend mode is linear dodge, and linear dodge increases the brightness and base colors based on the value of the blend color. So this is more brighter than screen, but a little less saturated than color dodge, and you can see the difference here. Color dodge is a little more saturated, and linear dodge less saturated. And lighter color, very similar to lighten, but they have the same differences as darken and darker color. Lighten looks at the RGB channels, and lighter color simply looks at the composite only. Okay, we're now going to look at the contrast blend modes, which are these guys here. They're overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid light, linear light, pin light, and hard mix, and they're in between these dividers here. And the blend modes in this group create contrasts by both lightening and darkening the result color. The blend modes work by checking to see if the colors are either darker than 50% gray or lighter than 50% gray. If they're darker than 50% gray, a darker blend mode is applied. If the colors are brighter than medium gray, then a brightening mode is applied. And 50% gray is transparent. This means that complementary blend modes are used to create the blend. For example, the overlay blend mode uses a combination of multiply and the screen blend modes. And what this means is that this blend mode will use the screen blend mode at half strength on colors that are lighter than 50% gray. So what that means is that from here, from the center, this is 50% gray, so it's invisible. So from here to the left, this blend mode is applying the screen blend mode, and from here to the right, it's applying the multiply blend mode, but at half strength. Something similar happens with soft light, but it's got a more subtle effect, and I actually like to use soft light to create a dodge and burn layer, and I'll show you how that works. I'm going to create a layer right above the original layer here. Then I'm going to go into edit, fill, and for contents I'm going to use 50% gray, press OK, and then I'm going to set the blend mode to soft light. I'm going to use the dodge and burn tools. First I'll use the burn tool, And I'm just going to add some shadows to this image here just to give it a little more shape. And obviously I'm going really quickly here, but you'll get the idea. Maybe some highlights on this side, like so. Maybe here and here. And I'm going to just press Control H to get rid of that guide so you can really see what's going on there. What this is going to do, it created some shadows and some highlights on my image. You can see the before and after there. How I completely changed the lighting of this image just by using a layer with 50% gray and using the dodge and burn tools and setting it to soft light. If I set it to normal, you'll see what this layer looks like. It's very simple. It just has gray and then some white areas that I created using the dodge tool and some darker areas that I use with the burn tool, and setting it to soft light again so you can see the difference. So that's one of the ways that you can use the soft light blend mode. The hard light blend mode works a lot like soft light, but with a harder intensity. Using pure white will result in white, and using pure black will result in black. And you can see that here, black and white, and obviously 15% gray gives you nothing. But with the luminance values here, you can see how this works. It's very similar to soft light, but much more intense. So that's hard light. Then we have vivid light. And vivid light is just simply an extreme version of soft and hard light. Anything darker than 50% gray becomes much darker, and anything lighter than 50% gray becomes much, much lighter. The contrast is also lowered in this effect, and you can see that here. Linear light uses a combination of the linear dodge blend mode and the linear burn blend mode. The colors brighten, but not as much as linear dodge, and the darker colors darken, but not as much as linear burn. The results are usually more extreme, and you can see that by the darker colors here, how it completely makes these darker. And by the way, some of these blend modes, you might be thinking that they're just too extreme and you'll never use them, but keep in mind, you can use the opacity slider on these blend modes, and they can give you some pretty good results with the right opacity. So just keep that in mind. You always have the opacity slider. We also have pin light. Pin light performs the darker and lightened blend modes at the same time. If the blend layer is lighter or darker than 50% gray, then it replaces the bottom layer's color information. If the bottom layer is darker in the dark areas or lighter in the dark areas, then you won't see a change. This blend mode is somewhat unpredictable, and it can result in patches or blotches of noise. And you can see that here, how we just have these patches of weird colors there. But again, you can always use the opacity slider if you want to, and you might get the result that you're looking for. The hard mix blend mode applies the blend by adding the value of each RGB channel in the blend layer to corresponding RGB channels in the base layer, converting each color into either all black or all white, resulting in the loss of a lot of detail. The result colors can only be red, green, blue, cyan, yellow, black, and white. And you can see that here. These are the only colors you'll see. You see white, black, blue, cyan, yellow, green, red. These are the only colors that you can have as a result in this blend mode. Now we have the difference blend modes, and these blend modes blend the layers based on the difference between the two layers. The following blend modes look for variations in the layers to create special effects. For example, the difference blend mode, if the blend color is white, it will invert the pixel below it. And actually, this might be a little easier to see how it works if I create a new layer and fill it with white. So I'm just going to set it back to normal, and watch what happens when I set it to difference. Essentially, it just inverts everything. So I'm going to set it back to normal. See how we have black going to white, white going to black, and then we have black, gray, and white here. Watch what happens when we set it to difference. It inverts the colors. So that's what's going on here as well. So it's a little bit easier to see if you have a white layer below it. It gives you a better visual representation, but that's what the difference blend mode does. If we switch over to exclusion, it's a very similar effect to difference, but it has a lot less contrast and it doesn't produce such a harsh result. And the areas of pure black cause no change. And notice what happens with 50% gray. It just completely keeps that gray and doesn't make any changes. So you can see the difference is very noticeable here. If I add the white layer, change it back to normal, you'll see the differences here. Then we have subtract, which subtracts brightness from the pixels below it. And you really can't see it that good here, but if I were to use this white layer here, and set it to subtract, you'll notice that it will turn everything below it black. So it's subtracting the brightness values from the layer below it. So if we turn this back on, you'll see that anything that was white, like on the left here and on the right and bottom here, will turn black since it's subtracting the brightness from those areas. And again, you have the opacity sliders to bring it down for a more desirable effect. We then have divide, and divide is sort of the opposite of subtract in a way. You'll see that the black pixels lighten up the image, so you see the black here and the dark shades here and here. Notice how when I switch it over to divide, it's going to brighten up those areas, and actually it's going to blow them out, but you can use the opacity slider if you want to. So just remember that the group here will sort of invert things. So dark pixels will turn result pixels lighter, and light pixels will turn result pixels darker. Then we move on to the hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. Now these blend modes will deal with color. So let's look at hue first, and look what happens when we change the blend mode to hue, and this layer just turns everything into sort of a grayscale image, and that's because none of the luminance values here have any hue whatsoever. So it will of course turn things into black and white. But if we add a layer that has color and we change it to hue, you'll see how the hue of the layer below it is going to change based on the layer above it. So the way this blend mode works is that it uses the luminance and saturation values of the base layer, which will be this layer here, and it takes the hue value from the blend layer, in this case this layer here, and it gives you the result that you see here. So just remember that this effect doesn't affect the saturation or lightness or darkness of the image, only the hue. So essentially you get the image from the lower layer with the colors of the top layer. Simply put, that's what happens. Then we're going to move on to saturation, and what saturation does is it keeps the saturation from this top layer, but it blends the luminosity and hue from the bottom layer here. And of course you can bring down the opacity on these guys as well, and I'm just going to move it around just so you can see how it works. Then we have the color blend mode. The way this blend mode works is that it applies the hue and saturation of the blend pixels, this layer here, to the layer below, which is this layer here. And obviously one of the things that you would use this for is when you have black and white images, you can set this layer to color, and you can color that layer. And this is more or less how you would add color to a black and white image. Of course you have different opacity levels, and you can add different layers with different colors to complete your effect. Essentially this is how you would go about it. So I'm just going to delete these layers because we don't need them. And finally we have luminosity, which keeps the luminance of the active layer. You really can't see much of what's going on here because there's not much luminance here, but if we go into the luminance layer I created there and change it to luminosity, you'll see what happens. So it keeps the luminance of this layer and it blends it with the hue and saturation of the layers below it. And of course you can change the opacity and get different results. There's two more blend modes that I want to talk about, and they're not found here. They're actually found with some tools, including the brush tool, in their blend mode, because some tools have blend modes as well. So the brush tool is one of those tools that has blend modes, and all the blend modes work exactly the same as they do with the layers panel, but there's two additional blend modes, the behind blend mode and the clear blend mode. The behind blend mode will apply paint only to transparent pixels in the layer. So you can't actually see that here because all the pixels in this layer are opaque. But if I create a new layer, and actually let me set this to normal, and I'm just gonna paint something on here, it really doesn't matter what, just that, and I changed the blend mode to behind, and I changed the color to maybe some sort of red, and I start painting, you'll notice that I'm only applying pixels to transparent pixels in this layer. The pixels that I painted earlier are not affected with the brush tool. So that's what the behind blend mode does. The clear blend mode is sort of like the eraser tool where you just delete pixels when you paint. So there's nothing too special about it. It's essentially the eraser tool. It works exactly the same way. So just keep those two in mind. Clear deletes, and behind paints on transparent pixels only. It doesn't paint on the opaque pixels. And that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something new. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more free Photoshop tutorials. Also, click on the like button and share this tutorial with your friends if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.